Admiral Sovethur did not watch the battle. He watched the numbers, sensor feed, distance markers, energy output from the human vessel. Structural integrity estimates that his system updated every 4 seconds. He stood at the center of the command deck of the Vrathsal, the largest warship the hegemony had ever launched, and he watched columns of data scroll down a pale blue screen, and he felt nothing in particular. 37 vessels against one. It was not a battle. Sovethur had been in battles. Battles had weight to them. A battle was two sides pressing against each other, like stone against stone, each one trying to find the crack in the other. This was not that. This was a notification made physical. The Vreth hegemony had told the human ship to leave the contested corridor near the Velorath system 3 times now. The human ship had responded with something its crew apparently called Standard Hailing Protocol, which, when translated, amounted to, "We are here. Please identify yourself and your intentions." Intention. Sovethur had found that almost interesting, the first time he read it. The humans wanted to discuss intentions, as if intentions were the relevant variable, as if what mattered was what a thing meant, rather than what a thing did. What the hegemony did was send 37 ships. The human vessel, his intelligence file identified it as the UNSC Inexorable, a destroyer-class deep-range ship, crew of 847. 4 years from its scheduled decommission responded to the arrival of 37. Vreth warships the way a cornered animal responds. It moved. It fired. Its weapons were not nothing. 3 of his ships took damage that would need attention at the next port. 1 of his officers would need a new arm grown, a process that would take 6 weeks and would be annoying. That was the full extent of what the Inexorable managed. The battle lasted 11 minutes. The wreckage took 6 hours to stop glowing. Sovethur watched the last heat signature fade on his screen. He pulled up the kill report template on his secondary console. He filled in the fields: vessel designation, crew count estimate, time of engagement, outcome. He filed it under contested corridor enforcement actions, a category he had used 43 times before. He added the Inexorable to the list. He saved the file. Then he dictated a brief status update to the hegemony's diplomatic relay and transmitted it on the standard channel the humans monitored. The message acknowledged the removal of the vessel from the corridor and invited the human government to respond through official channels if they wished to discuss the terms of the corridor's status going forward. He was being generous. That was the word his culture used. Generous. To give the defeated party an opportunity to speak, to formally offer the path to submission, rather than simply assuming it. He went to bed. Yara Osei had been awake for 19 hours when the feed cut out. She sat at her console in listening post, Delta 7, 4 people, 1 ship the size of a transit bus, parked at the edge of the Velorath system behind a sensor-dampening rock formation that the hegemony either hadn't found or hadn't bothered to eliminate. And she watched the last signature of the Inexorable disappear from her screen. The debris field was still visible on passive scan. It would be visible for a long time. Some of those pieces were large. She sat with that for a moment. Nobody on the post said anything. Yara could hear Technician Brast breathing behind her, slightly too loud, the way people breathe when they are trying to control it. She could hear the ambient hum of the post's life support. She could hear, faintly, the coffee going cold in the mug by her left hand. 847 people. She had known 4 of them, not well. The way you know people in this branch of service: names, faces, 1 shared meal maybe. The mutual understanding that you were all very far from anywhere that mattered. She had known Petty Officer Declan Rowe from a transfer station layover, and she remembered that he had talked too much about a band nobody else knew, and she had pretended to find it interesting because it was a 16-hour layover, and she had nothing else to do. She did not think about Declan Rowe now. She opened the transmission log. She composed a priority message to UNSC Command, Earth Relay. She attached the full sensor record of the engagement. All 11 minutes of it. The debris field data. The Vreth fleet composition. Sovethur's status update, which her system had intercepted and translated. She read the translation twice. The Vreth admiral had invited humanity to respond through official channels. Yara typed her own observation note at the bottom of the report. It was not standard protocol to include personal notes. She included it anyway. It said, "The Vreth admiral filed his kill report before the heat signatures cleared. I watched him do it on the intercepted command feed. He filed it the way you file a shipping receipt. I want command to know that. She sent the report. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at her hands. They were not shaking. She thought they should be shaking. She thought about that, about why they weren't. And she realized it was because she had passed through the part of this that felt like grief about 40 minutes ago, when the last big piece of the inexorable had broken apart on the passive scan, and she'd understood that there was no part of this that was going to be okay. She'd used up the shaking somewhere in there. What was left was something else, something that sat very still. Brast came up behind her and put a hand on her shoulder. She let him. She stared at the debris field coordinates on her screen. The field would drift. In a few years, the pieces would scatter across the corridor, and in 100 years, you wouldn't be able to tell there had been a ship there. Just metal, just iron and composite and the particular alloys that humans used in their fourth-generation hulls, floating in the dark like everything else floats in the dark eventually. 847. She pulled up the crew manifest. She had not looked at it before. She looked at it now. She scrolled through it slowly. She did not recognize most of the names. She recognized 4. She stopped at Declan Rose, petty officer, 2nd class, 29 years old, from a town in the west of Ireland that Yara had never heard of and would now never visit. She closed the manifest. She did not open it again. The Vreth hegemony's diplomatic relay waited for a human response. It was designed to wait. It had waited for responses from 43 civilizations at various points in the last 3 centuries. Most of them had responded within 1 or 2 cycles. The fastest had responded in 4 hours, a species called the Sulith Va, small and purple and extremely anxious about everything, who had transmitted a formal apology, a territorial concession, and a gift of significant cultural value before the hegemony's first warship had even cleared their home system's outer edge. The Vreth did not dislike the Sulith Va. The relay waited. Day 1 passed. The relay logged. No response. Standard protocol. Continue monitoring. Day 3. No response. Day 7. The hegemony's Xenopsychology division produced its first assessment. It was a short document, confident in its conclusions. The humans were in a grief phase. Their species bonded in unusually strong clusters, family units, crew units, national units, and mass death created a destabilizing disruption in those clusters. The species needed time to process loss before it could engage in rational diplomatic exchange. This was well documented in the hegemony's files. 3 other species had shown similar response delays after military corrections. Expected response window: 30 to 60 cycles. The diplomatic channel stayed open. The hegemony's trade desk quietly adjusted the tariff structures on goods moving through the corridor. The contested zone was reclassified as hegemony administered. The paperwork was filed under Standard Territorial Acquisition Protocol, a category that required no outside acknowledgement to become legally binding under hegemony law. It was tidy. Sovether submitted a commendation report for 3 of his tactical officers and moved on to other assignments. There were always other assignments. The message, when it finally came, arrived on day 12. Not from the human government, not from their military command. It came from a civilian academic at a university on the human homeworld, a xenolinguistics professor named Dr. Alia Stern, who had apparently been contracted by someone to do a translation verification. She sent a single transmission asking for confirmation that the hegemony's original notification, the 9-paragraph document transmitted to the inexorable before its destruction, had been correctly received and rendered in the human standard language. The hegemony's diplomatic office confirmed it had. Dr. Stern thanked them and ended the transmission. The diplomatic office logged it as an administrative follow-up and filed it accordingly. Nobody flagged it. The listening post received a resupply drone on day 15. Yara helped unload it. Mostly food. Mostly the kind of food that didn't need cooking, dense, brick-shaped rations that tasted like cardboard but kept you alive, which was the relevant metric this far out. There were also new data cores, 3 maintenance replacement parts for the sensor array, and a sealed communication packet addressed to Yara personally from her immediate superior at UNSC Command. She opened it in private. It said, "Your personal notation has been received. It has been forwarded to the relevant parties. No further action is required from your end at this time. Relevant partie." She folded the message. She put it in her jacket pocket. She went back to unloading the drone. Brast asked her if everything was okay. She said yes. She was not lying, exactly. She just didn't have a better word for what everything was. On day 19, the sensor array picked up something strange. Not a ship. Not a weapon signature. Something Yara had to look at 3 times before she was sure she was reading it right. A mathematical transmission. Tight beam. Aimed not at any populated system but at a stretch of open space on the far side of the corridor. Prime sequences. The kind of signal a species sends when it wants to prove it exists. We are here. We are ordered. We are intelligent. The kind of signal humans had sent out into deep space a long time ago. Before they'd found anyone to send it to, Yara ran the origin trace. It came from Earth. She logged it. She sent it up the chain. She noted that the coordinates being targeted were not inhabited, not strategically significant, not anything, just space. She went back to her shift. She told herself it was a test, equipment calibration. Something like that. She did not entirely believe herself. The Vreth relay was still waiting on day 22. The Xenopsychology Division updated its assessment. The grief phase was running longer than predicted. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. The third species in the comparison said a bird-descended civilization the hegemony had corrected near the outer bands, about 80 years ago, had taken 21 cycles to respond. The humans were approaching that record. The updated recommendation: continue waiting. Increase diplomatic monitoring. Do not adjust territorial reclassification timeline. The second recommendation was written by a junior analyst named Vethori, submitted as an addendum to the main document, formatted in the smaller font that the division used for dissenting or minority opinions. It said, "I want to note for the record that the human response delay may not be grief-related. The absence of communication is not the same as the absence of action. Our monitoring of human internal channels is limited. We are watching a door and assuming nothing is happening on the other side of it." Vethori's supervisor read it, noted it, and did not include it in the summary document sent to the hegemony's senior council. He reassigned Vethori to cartography the following morning. It was not a punishment, officially. It was a reallocation of resources. Vethori was told his skills were needed in the mapping division. He packed his things. He did not argue. He was, by nature, a person who wrote addendums rather than arguments. He took his personal datapad with him. He kept working on his own. Yara was on her third watch of a 36-hour rotation when the second mathematical transmission fired. Same format. Different coordinates. Still aimed at nothing, a dead zone in the Velorath outer band. No star. No debris. No waypoint of any kind. She sat up straight. She pulled up the first transmission's coordinates and laid them next to the second. She stared at the 2 points in space for a long time. She pulled up a star map of the system and surrounding region. The kind of map that showed every registered Vreth holding within 4 light-years. She placed the 2 coordinate points on the map, then she sat very still for about 40 seconds. She thought about Declan Rowe. She thought about the debris field, which had drifted now, which was just pieces in the dark. She thought about the kill report that had been filed before the heat signatures cleared. She deleted the coordinates from her personal screen. She would not put this one in the log. Some things, she had decided, did not need to be handed to the Vreth's intercept teams on a silver plate. The diplomatic relay was still open when day 40 arrived. It had now been open longer than any previous post-correction response window in the hegemony's documented history. The Xenopsychology Division had stopped issuing timeline estimates. Soveth-Ur received a query from his command asking if he thought a second notification was warranted. He considered it. He composed a response recommending patience. The humans were a young civilization. They had limited military resources. They had lost a single ship, painful, yes, but not civilization-ending. They would come to the table. Every species did. He sent the response and returned to his other work. That night, if night was the right word for the dark cycle on a warship that never truly slept, he reviewed the sensor record of the inexorable one more time. He had done this several times now, though he would not have been able to say why. He watched the 11 minutes of it. He watched the human ship move hard, aggressive, committed, firing everything it had into the face of 37 warships, with the particular focus of something that understood it was going to lose. and had simply decided that understanding was not a reason to stop. He closed the file. He filed nothing about his thoughts. He was not certain his thoughts had a category. Day 41. The response came. The Hegemony's diplomatic office received a transmission from UNSC Command, Earth. Standard format. Correct authentication codes. Timestamped and logged at 061, 4 hours. Relay station time. The duty officer opened it, expecting the formal protest structure. There were templates for this. Established forms that civilizations used when they wanted to register objection to a military correction. He expected references to casualties. He expected language about territorial rights, about violations of deep space navigation accords, about the value of human life. He expected, honestly, a number. There was always a number. The number was the beginning of the negotiation. He read the transmission. He read it again. He checked the authentication 3 times. The transmission was 2 sentences. The first sentence was a reference number, the Hegemony's own 9-paragraph notification, filed before the destruction of the inexorable, cross-referenced by its official document ID. The second sentence was, received and acknowledged. Nothing else. The duty officer stared at his screen. He called his supervisor. His supervisor read it. He called his supervisor. Sovethur was woken up at 0340 by a priority summons. He sat at his console with sleep still heavy in his joints and read the 2 sentences on his screen. Received and acknowledged. He sat there for a long time. Outside the Vrathsol's viewports, the corridor drifted quiet and cold. The reclassified territory sat exactly where it had sat before. The kill report was filed. The paperwork was clean. Everything was in order. Received and acknowledged. He read it a 3rd time. Then he did something he had not done since the early years of his career. Before 43 corrections had made him very sure he knew how these things went. He was not sure. He pulled up the intelligence file on humanity. He read it from the first page. Their history, their wars, and there had been many, enormous ones. The kind that left marks on a civilization's psychology for centuries. Their technology trajectory, their current military capacity, which was assessed as limited, below the threshold of meaningful threat. He read the note about their internal psychology, the bonding, the grief. He thought about the silence, not the silence of grief, the silence of something that had already decided. He typed a single message to his intelligence chief and sent it before he could think too much about whether it was the right move. It said, "What are they building?" The response came back in 3 hours. It said, "We don't have clear visibility. Our monitoring of their internal manufacturing channels is limited. There is increased energy output from several of their off-world installations, but the signature profiles are inconclusive. Assessment is ongoing." Sovethur read that. Assessment is ongoing. He looked at the corridor on his nav screen. He looked at the debris field coordinates, still logged in his system from day 1. Now just ghost data, pointing at empty space. He thought about the inexorable, the way it had moved, the way it had kept firing, the particular quality of a thing that had decided. He opened the kill report one more time. He looked at the category he'd filed it under. Contested corridor enforcement actions. He stared at it for a very long time. He did not change it. He would change it later. He would find, when later arrived, that there was no category in the system that fit. He would have to create one. He would call it miscalculation. But that was later. Right now, on day 41, with 2 sentences on his screen and a cold quiet on a diplomatic channel that should have been full of noise and wasn't, he sat in the dark of his command ship and felt something he had not felt in 43 corrections. He felt the ground shift, not under his feet. There were no feet involved. It was something older than that, something in the part of him that was, before it was an admiral, before it was a soldier, before it was anything the hegemony had shaped it into, just an animal. And the animal said, "Something is wrong." He did not sleep again that night. 40 light-years away, on a planet that was about to become the quietest, busiest place in the known galaxy. 61 warships were nearly ready. The first thing they did was go quiet. Not the quiet of grief, not the quiet of shock. The Vreth Xenopsychology Division had cataloged both of those. Grief quiet had a shape to it. You could see it in the communication patterns, the spike of internal transmissions between bonded units, the way a species turned inward and talked to itself more than usual when it was hurting. Shock quiet looked different, more like static, like a system trying to reboot. This was neither. This was the quiet of a door closing. The hegemony's monitoring team spent the first week logging the absence of things. No formal protest filed with the Interstellar Commerce Relay. No emergency session called at the neutral ground diplomatic station near the Ketvora Junction. No public statement from the human government's leadership. The human news channels ran the story, the inexorable, the crew count, the 11 minutes, and then the human government said nothing. And after a few days, the monitoring teams noted that the news channels had gone quieter too. Not silent, but quieter. Like something had been decided and everyone who lived inside that decision had agreed, without meeting, without voting, that there was no point in being loud about it. The hegemony's lead diplomatic analyst, a careful woman named Sveth Ara, wrote in her Day 7 summary, "The human government's silence is not absence of engagement. It is a form of engagement. We should treat it as communication." Her supervisor read it and wrote back, "Speculative. Revised to reflect observable data only." She revised it. She kept the original in a personal file. On Titan, the third shift never went home. It was not an order, exactly. There was a memo, 3 paragraphs, dry language, the kind of document that said, increased operational tempo rather than we are working through the night, until further notice. But the third shift read the memo and looked at each other and nobody put on their coats. The bay was large enough to swallow a city block. It smelled of welded metal and coolant, and the particular sharpness of materials being pushed past their comfort range. Workers moved in the specific way that people move when they are tired but not stopping, heads down, efficient. The unnecessary movements cut away. Nothing left but the work. Foreman Dessa Ybarra had been running the bay for 11 years. She had seen surge periods before military contracts, emergency retrofit schedules, the occasional political decision that translated into overtime for everyone below it. She had never seen anything like this. The frames going up in Bay 7 were not a retrofit. She knew the general silhouette of every human warship class in service. She had worked on most of them at one point or another. These frames were not a class she recognized. They were longer than anything she'd worked on. The forward section had a geometry she couldn't quite resolve, angles that looked wrong until you stared at them long enough to understand they were only wrong in comparison to what had come before. She didn't ask questions. She had learned, in 11 years, that you didn't ask certain questions when the paperwork came with that particular level of classification stamp. She just made sure Bay 7 ran 3 shifts a day and that nobody went home before the day's targets were met. She bought coffee for the third shift out of her own account. It seemed like the right thing to do. The vote in the UN Security Council happened on day 11. 15 members, 15 votes, yes. No debate recorded in the official minutes, no speeches. The session lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds, which was shorter than the time it took most members to find their seats. Whatever was voted on was not in the public record. The session was classified at a level that most government officials would spend their entire careers without ever seeing. 2 things became visible from the outside. Afterward, first, 3 manufacturing installations that had been running at standard capacity began running at something significantly beyond standard capacity. The energy output alone was measurable from a distance. The hegemony sensors logged it as industrial activity, likely civilian, possibly construction-related. They flagged it low priority. Second, Admiral Cressida Vane, who had been on scheduled leave following the completion of a patrol rotation near the outer rim, was recalled. She was given a new assignment. The assignment had no public designation. She was simply gone from the leave roster and present, according to internal UNSC tracking, at an undisclosed installation. A journalist on Earth's largest news platform tried to file a query with the UNSC press office about the recall. The press office responded with the standard form letter it sent when it had nothing to say. The journalist filed it away. She had a lot of form letters. Vane arrived at the installation on a transport that did not appear on any civilian flight log. The installation was cold. Everything in this part of space was cold. It was a working principle of the universe that the further you got from anything warm and alive, the more cold asserted itself as the natural state of things. The installation's corridors were wide, lit by strips of pale, functional light, and smelled of a cleaning compound that was doing its best against the underlying smell of metal and distance. Her aide, Lieutenant Sorrow, met her at the airlock. He was 26 years old and had the kind of precise posture that comes from being young enough to still believe that posture matters. He had a data pad in his hand and a look on his face that meant he had things to tell her and wasn't sure which one to lead with. She let him walk with her. She looked at the bay they were passing. The ships being assembled there were visible through the observation glass, not finished, not even close, but enough of a shape to see. She looked at them for a long moment. "The notification," she said. Sorrow looked at his data pad. He had a briefing queued. Staffing assignments, supply chain status, projected completion timelines. "The Vreth notification," she said, the 9-paragraph document they transmitted to the inexorable before they destroyed it. "Get me the original, not a translation. The original, in Vreth standard, with the translation appended." He wrote it down. "I'll have it to you before the briefing. I want it on the bridge." He looked up. "The bridge of whichever ship I'm on when we leave." She did not look away from the observation glass. "I want it framed, if we have anything to frame it with. If not, print it and put it somewhere I can see it." He wrote that down too. He did not ask why. He had been her aide for 2 years. He had learned, in 2 years, that when she asked for something without explaining herself, the explanation would become clear, at a point that she had already calculated, and he had not reached yet. They walked on. She said nothing else for the rest of the walk. He would think about that later, about how she had walked through an installation full of ships being built for a war, and said only 2 things. She had asked for the notification, and she had said she wanted it where she could see it, not as a reminder of what was done to them. He would figure that out much later. She wanted it where she could see it, to remember exactly what had been said, exactly how it had been worded, the specific language of a species that thought it was being generous. The Vreth received the first mathematical signal on day 19. Prime sequences. Tight beam. Aimed at nothing. The signals desk logged it and ran it through the standard analysis filter. The filter returned non-hostile, non-directed, mathematical pattern, consistent with exploratory or calibration transmissions. The filter further noted that the target coordinates contained no strategic assets, no population centers, no navigational significance. Low priority. Filed. Moved on. The second signal came on day 23. Same format, different coordinates. Still aimed at nothing. The signals desk ran the same analysis, got the same result, logged it, filed it. The analyst who processed both signals, a quiet, methodical person named HFY, noticed that the 2 sets of coordinates had something in common. She couldn't immediately say what. The sensation was more instinctive than analytical, the feeling that 2 things were related before you could explain why. She pulled both coordinates up on her mapping system and looked at them side by side. She could not see the connection. She moved on to the next item in her queue. She had 43 items waiting. Vethori, in cartography, had a lot of time to think. Cartography was not a demanding assignment for someone with his background. His previous work had been analytical pattern recognition, behavioral modeling, the kind of close reading of data that required staying with something long enough for its shape to reveal itself. Cartography required precision and patience, and a willingness to update maps that had not changed meaningfully in decades. It was quiet work. He didn't mind quiet work. He had brought his personal data pad, which contained everything he had been working on before the reassignment. He reviewed it during his breaks. He updated it when he had new information. He had, over the course of his career, developed the habit of keeping 2 files, one for what he could prove and one for what he suspected. The second file was always larger. He added to the second file every few days. On day 26, the signals desk circulated a routine report that included, in its appendix, a summary of unusual transmissions received in the monitoring period. It was the kind of document that went to everyone in the analytical division as a matter of protocol, and that most people read the first paragraph of before moving on. Vethori read all of it. He read the section on the prime sequence transmissions twice. He opened his mapping system. He pulled up the target coordinates for both signals. He looked at them for a long time. Then he pulled up a map of Vreth-controlled space, every holding, every population center, every installation of strategic value within the relevant range. The kind of map that cartography kept constantly updated, because this was, among other things, what cartography was for. He overlaid the two coordinate points. The first point lined up with nothing. The second point lined up with nothing. But between them, and extending outward from them, there was a line, a geometric implication, the kind of line that only existed if there were more points coming, the kind of line that, if you extended it in the direction the mathematics suggested, passed through. His console made a soft sound. He looked at the notification on his screen. Access to this mapping layer has been restricted. Please contact your department supervisor for authorization. Otterai. He had accessed this mapping layer every day for the past 6 weeks. It was a standard cartography resource. There was no reason for it to be restricted. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the last thing he had seen before the map was locked the line. Incomplete. The extension of it leading toward the place it seemed to be leading. He closed his console. He picked up his personal data pad. He opened the second file, the one for things he suspected but couldn't prove. He wrote 3 sentences and then stopped. He sat there for a minute. Then he deleted the 3 sentences and wrote one instead. It said, "They are not aiming at nothing." On day 31, a journalist named Petra Solms, based in the city of Rotterdam on Earth, received an anonymous data packet through a channel she used for source communications. The packet contained no identifying information. It contained a partial analysis coordinate data, map overlays, a series of calculations that Petra, who was not a mathematician, found almost impossible to follow. At the bottom of the analysis was a handwritten note, photographed and included as an image file. The handwriting was small and careful. The note said, "I cannot tell you who I am. I can tell you that what I have sent you is a pattern. I can tell you that the pattern is not complete yet, because they have not finished sending the signals. I can tell you that when it is complete, you will understand what it means without me having to explain it. Please watch for the rest of the signals. Please keep this safe." Petra read the note several times. She was a journalist who had covered military affairs for 9 years. She had a sense for things that were being hidden not in a mystical way, just in the way that a person develops instincts after enough years of watching people try to say nothing while meaning everything. She understood that this was either very significant or completely meaningless. She could not yet tell which. She saved the packet in her most secure storage. She set an alert for any new signals matching the described format. She sat on it. She sat on it for 3 days, which was as long as she could manage before the thing living in the back of her head, where important information went to pace around, made it impossible to think about anything else. Then she made some calls. The Hegemony's Xenopsychology Division submitted its Day 30 assessment. It was the most uncertain document the division had produced in 40 years of operation. The lead author, Svethara, had pushed for language that reflected what they actually knew, which was very little, rather than what the council wanted to hear, which was reassurance. The document said, in its summary, "The human silence has now exceeded every precedent in our post-correction behavioral database. We are unable to accurately model this response because we have no equivalent data set. We do not know what they are doing. We do not know what they intend. We are watching the outside of a process we cannot see inside." It said, "This should concern us." It said, "We recommend significant expansion of our intelligence resources directed at human internal communications and manufacturing activity. We recommend this immediately." The council received the document on day 31. They discussed it on day 33. The recommendation for expanded intelligence resources was approved in principle to be implemented over the next 40 cycles through standard channels. 40 cycles. On day 38, Yara Ose received a personal message from her mother. It was a short message. Her mother was not a person who wrote long messages. She said she had been thinking about Yara and wanted to make sure she was eating enough because she always stopped eating when she was stressed. She said that Yara's younger brother had passed his engineering exams and the family was very proud. She said she had lit a candle at the memorial service for the crew of the Inexorable because it seemed like the right thing to do even though she hadn't known any of them personally. She closed the message with, "Come home when you can, baby. This will be over eventually." Yara read the message twice. She thought about writing back. She wanted to say, "I don't think you know what over means, right now. I don't think any of us do." She wanted to say, "I saw the debris field, Mom. I watched it on my screen and it was 11 minutes. And I want you to understand that 11 minutes is how long it takes to end 847 people. And we are quiet about it. We are so quiet, and the quiet is not nothing. She wrote back, I'm eating fine. Tell Marcus congratulations. I love you. She sent it. She went back to her console. On the passive scan, nothing unusual. The corridor sat empty. The debris field had drifted further now, scattered by the slow mechanics of space into a wider spread of nothing in particular. She logged her shift notes. She did not log the third signal. It had come at 0211 hours. Same format, new coordinates. She had looked at where they pointed, and then she had closed the window and she had not opened it again. Some things were not for the Vreth intercept teams. Some things were just for the people who were going to be there. Day 41. Titan. Bay 7. The ships were not finished. They would not be finished for some weeks yet. But the first one, the lead vessel, the one that would carry Cressida Vane and the notification, framed now, in a square of functional black metal, was close enough. She walked her ship from bow to stern at 0500 hours. The crew was awake. All of them. Not because they had been told to be. Nobody had told them anything about this morning. They were just awake, standing at their stations or in the corridor or at the observation ports, watching her walk through. She did not give a speech. She was not a person who gave speeches before things. Speeches were for after, when there was something to say about what had happened. Before, there was only the work. She walked to the bridge. She stood in front of the notification, the 9 paragraphs. Vreth standard on the left, human translation on the right, framed in black on the wall ahead of her nav console, where she would see it every time she looked up. She read it once, beginning to end. She thought about the inexorable. The crew manifest, 847 names, and she had made herself memorize them, all of them, even the ones she didn't know, because it seemed like the kind of thing that mattered. The kind of thing you carried. She thought about the notification's last paragraph. The part that invited the human government to respond through official channels. Generous. They had called it generous. Sorrow appeared at the bridge entrance. He had a data pad with today's status reports and the look on his face that meant everything was on schedule. She said, Tell me we're ready. He said, Close enough to ready. She nodded once. Then we're ready. She looked at the notification one more time. She thought, we received it, we acknowledged it, and now we're going to respond. The fleet dropped out of FTL at 0340 hours. Relay time. 61 ships. They came out of faster-than-light travel in a formation that the Vreth Defense Network sensors had never seen before, not a standard engagement spread, not an assault wedge, not any of the recognized patterns in the Hegemony's tactical database. The formation was tight at the center and wide at the edges, like something designed not to attack a single point, but to fill a space completely, like something designed to make leaving difficult. The planetary defense commander at Keth Sovara was a veteran officer named Soth Van, who had held his post for 12 years. He had run 17 emergency drills. He had responded to 2 minor incursion events and 1 navigation accident that had briefly looked like something worse. He was not, by anyone's measure, an unprepared man. He looked at his sensor screen for approximately 4 seconds. Then he hit the emergency broadcast. Keth Sovara was the oldest colonial world in the hegemony, not the most populated, not the most productive, not strategically vital in any way that a military analyst would circle on a map, but it was the first world the hegemony had ever settled beyond its home system, 400 years ago, when the species was young and expanding, and full of the particular energy that comes from believing the universe is large enough for everyone to have a piece of it. The first settlers had come in generation ships, slow by modern standards, and they had landed on a world of red stone plains and shallow inland seas and sky that ran a particular shade of amber at sunset that you could not find anywhere else in the known systems. They had built, they had named things, they had buried their dead in the red stone and called the world home, and their children had called it home, and their children's children, and 400 years of that accumulating until Keth Sovara was not just a place but a word that meant something in the hegemony's history, in its schools, in the particular pride that a civilization takes in the first step it ever took beyond itself. 340 million people live there now. Most of them were asleep when Soth Van hit the emergency broadcast. The human fleet's first transmission was not weapons fire. Soth Van had his defense grid live within 90 seconds of the fleet's arrival, which was faster than the drills, adrenaline compressing the steps. and he had targeting solutions running on the 6 lead human ships within the first 2 minutes. And he was waiting for the order from command to fire when his communications officer said, very carefully, "Sir, they're broadcasting. Not a targeting ping, not a tactical signal. Audio. On every frequency his system monitored. In Vreth standard." He said, "Play it." The voice was human, flat, unhurried, clearly a recording rather than a live speaker. It spoke in Vreth standard, with an accent that was slightly imprecise around the longer consonants but entirely comprehensible. It said, "This is a notification from the United Nations Space Command to the population of Keth Sovara and all Vreth hegemony personnel in this system. You have 4 hours to evacuate. All civilian vessels departing the system will not be fired upon. All civilian vessels departing the system will be given clear passage. Medical and emergency ships will be given priority clearance. This window opens now." Then it repeated. Then it kept repeating. Sothvan stared at his communications console. The recording looped again from the beginning. He recognized, after a moment, that the voice was reading something, not a prepared statement, something specific. He listened more carefully and then he recognized the cadence, the formal structure of it, the legal phrasing. He had heard this document before. Everyone in the hegemony who followed the diplomatic feeds had heard this document. It was the notification, the 9-paragraph notification that the hegemony had filed before destroying the inexorable. Every word of it, read aloud, in Vreth standard, on repeat. They had sent a notification, and now the humans were playing it back. He sat with that for 1 second. 2. The recording reached the paragraph about generous provision of official channels. It kept going. It would keep going for 4 hours. Every person on Keth Sovara with a communications device was hearing it. Every person waking up to the emergency broadcast was hearing the hegemony's own words read back to them by the people who had come to answer it. He opened a channel to planetary civil defense. He said, "Begin evacuation protocol. Full civilian priority. Everything that can fly gets in the air." His second-in-command said, "Sir, do we return fire?" He looked at the sensor feed. 61 ships, holding position, not advancing, not targeting, waiting out the 4 hours with a patience that felt, to Sothvan, like the most frightening thing he had encountered in 12 years of defense work. "Not yet," he said. He was not sure yet was the right word. He used it because it was the only word his training gave him for this situation, and his training had not, in 12 years, prepared him for this situation. He started counting ships, how many he had, how many they had, what the math said. He knew what the math said. He got on the channel to civil defense. Aboard the lead human ship, the UNSC Relentless, Admiral Cressida Vane stood at the forward viewport. Her hands were clasped behind her back. This was a habit, something she did when she needed her hands to be somewhere they wouldn't interfere with her thinking. She had done it since her first command posting, 15 years ago. Standing at viewports considerably less impressive than this one, looking at considerably less consequential things, she watched Keth Sovara from approximately 12,000 kilometers out. At this distance it was a disk of amber and rust and the dark blue of its shallow seas. The amber sky visible even from here, as a thin, bright line around its edges, where the atmosphere caught the system's star. It was a beautiful world. She had not expected that. She had reviewed the survey data, the geographic reports, the population distribution maps, all the practical information. She had not thought to look for pictures. She had found one, the night before, in a civilian archive. An amateur photograph taken by a settler's descendant about 60 years ago. Standing on one of the red stone plains with the amber sky behind her and the nearest sea visible at the horizon. The person in the photograph was old, and she was smiling, and she was standing on the ground of a world her family had lived on for 4 generations. Vane had looked at the photograph for a long time. She was thinking about it now. Sorrow appeared at the edge of her vision. He had a status report. Evacuation feeds, civil defense communications, the number of ships leaving Keth Sovara's atmosphere, updated every 15 minutes. She said, "How many are moving?" "Civil defense activated within 4 minutes of our broadcast. They're moving fast." He looked at the datapad. Early estimate puts departure rate at roughly 2 million per hour. If it holds, it won't hold. It'll slow down. She had studied evacuation data for weeks. Populations moved fast at first, when fear was clean and simple. Then they slowed people going back for things, people refusing to leave, people who had nowhere to go and stood in the middle of the street because the choice between leaving everything and leaving didn't feel like a choice at all. "We log every ship that clears the system," she said. "Already running. Every one, Sorrow. I want the count continuous." He said, "Yes, Admiral." She looked at the world. She thought about the photograph. The old woman. The amber sky. 4 generations of a family in the red stone ground. She thought about a kill report filed before the heat signatures cleared. She thought, this is what we decided to become to get them to the table. She thought, I need to know that was true. She clasped her hands tighter behind her back. She watched the evacuation ships rise. Inside Kethsovara, it looked like this. The emergency broadcast woke people in the middle of the night. The alien voice speaking Vreth standard across every device in every home. The notification on repeat, recognizable within the first sentence to anyone who had read the news in the last 2 months. Which was everyone. Most people moved immediately. The particular animal intelligence that lives below thought and training said, 61 ships and 4 hours. And the legs were already moving before the brain finished its calculation. Some people did not move. An old man in the capital city named Vreth Sol, who had been born on Kethsovara, and whose parents had been born on Kethsovara, and whose grandparents had helped survey the southern Redstone Plains before he was a thought in anyone's mind, sat in his kitchen and listened to the broadcast and looked at the window and looked at his hands and did not stand up. His daughter found him there 40 minutes later. She had come back for him after getting her children onto an evacuation transport. She stood in his kitchen doorway and said, "Father, we have to go." He looked at her. He said, "I was born in this house." She said, "I know." He said, "My mother is buried 3 streets from here." She said, "Father." The broadcast repeated. The notification, patient and mechanical, reading itself back to everyone who could hear it. He stood up. He did not take anything. He walked out of his house and he did not look at it again because he knew that if he looked at it he would stop walking and he could not stop walking. His daughter held his arm and they walked to the transport and they left. 3 hours and 51 minutes into the window, Sothvan filed his final evacuation count. 331 million. He stood in a command center that was being powered down around him, non-essential systems shutting off in sequence, his remaining staff moving to evacuation transports. He had stayed as long as he could stay. He had told himself he would stay until the last transport, which had left 11 minutes ago. Now he was telling himself he would stay until the window closed, which was 9 minutes away. He looked at the sensor feed. The human fleet had not moved in 4 hours. It had held its formation. It had fired nothing. It had simply sat there, 61 ships, broadcasting the notification on every frequency, and waited. 9 million people had not made it to the transports. He had the number in his head, and he could not put it anywhere useful. 9 million was too large a number to hold. It kept sliding out from under him when he tried to think about it directly. So he thought about it sideways. He thought about specific streets in the capital city, specific districts, the market near the central station that ran all night, the school his children had attended before he'd moved them to the homeworld. He thought about the particular weight of 9 million people's ordinary lives, and he could not hold that either. He picked up his command kit. He walked to the last transport. He did not look at the sensor feed as he left. He did not need to. He knew what was about to be on it. Vane watched the window close. The counter on her secondary screen ticked over. 4 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. She said, "Begin." The fleet moved with the precision that months of preparation produces, not fast, not dramatic, not the kind of overwhelming rush that looks impressive on a tactical display. Methodical, interval-spaced, target-sequenced. The weapons the fleet carried were not the standard ordnance of a conventional engagement. They had been designed specifically for this mission, by engineers who had been given a single operational requirement. Permanent, not fast, not clean in the way that leaves things intact. Permanent. Sorrow stood beside her. He said nothing. The bridge crew worked in the specific silence of people doing a difficult thing that they have decided to do, and have no remaining words about. She kept her hands clasped behind her back. She watched. The weapons reached the surface in sequence, working outward from the population centers, methodical, Interval by interval, the planet's atmosphere lit in places not fire exactly, but a kind of energy release that had its own color, something between orange and white, something that made the amber sky look briefly like it had always looked before it became something else. She thought about the notification, all 9 paragraphs of it, playing on repeat in the ears of everyone who had been woken up in the dark and told they had 4 hours. She thought, they filed it like a shipping receipt. She thought, 847 people. She stood at the viewport for the full duration. She did not look away. She had decided, before the mission launched, that she would not look away. That looking away was something you did when you wanted to do a thing without being responsible for it. She was responsible for it. She had given every order that led to this moment. She had signed every document. She had stood in front of the notification on her wall every morning of this mission and read all 9 paragraphs and thought about the inexorable, and thought about what it had taken to get to this table that the hegemony had not yet sat down at and would not sit down at until they understood something. This was the something. This was the only language that certain things could be said in. She did not like that. She did not look away. Sorrow updated the evacuation count at the end of it. He did not say it aloud. He put it on her secondary screen. She read it. 331 million out. She said, "Log it." He said, "Already logged." She said, "All of it. The window, the count, the departure times, every ship that cleared the system." "Yes, Admiral." She looked at what was left of Keth Sovara on her sensor feed. From 12,000 kilometers, it looked different now. The amber and rust and dark blue had been replaced by something uniform and gray, like the color of a thing that has been completed. The shallow seas were gone. The red stone plains were gone. The amber sky that made sunsets a particular color no other world could replicate, gone. She thought about the old woman in the photograph, standing in the red stone plain 60 years ago, smiling. She thought, "I'm sorry." She did not say it aloud. She turned from the viewport. She said, "Next coordinates. Standard transit." The fleet moved. The notification kept broadcasting behind them, still looping on the frequencies, until the signal finally faded with distance into the background static of space, just another sound the universe made, indistinguishable at last from everything else that traveled through the dark, looking for something to reach. Keth Sovara stayed where it was, named, empty. The first one. In a listening post 17 light minutes away, Yara Osei was not on duty. She was in her bunk, eyes open, staring at the ceiling of the small metal room she had occupied for 8 months. She had calculated the timing. She had known, from the fleet's last logged position, approximately when it would reach Keth Sovara. She had not gone to her console to watch. She had lain in her bunk instead, in the dark, eyes open. She thought about Declan Rowe. She thought about the band nobody else had known. The 16-hour layover. The polite pretending. She thought, "I hope you knew it mattered." She thought, "I hope someone said it to you clearly." She lay in the dark until her shift started. Then she got up. She went to her console. She logged in. She did her job. Outside, in the corridor, Technician Brast was making coffee. She could smell it. She could hear the particular sound of the machine that they'd fixed 3 times, and that worked now, but only if you pressed the side panel while it was heating. He brought her a cup without being asked. She wrapped both hands around it. She said, "Thanks." He said, "Yeah." They did not talk about Keth Sovara. There was nothing to say about it that the universe wasn't already saying. In the particular silence of a world that had been named for 400 years and was now, for the first time, quiet. The Vreth sent 40 ambassadors. They arrived at the neutral station near the Ketvora Junction on a ship that was, by design, visibly unarmed. The station was old, built 300 years ago as a trading post, expanded twice, now used almost entirely for diplomatic meetings between species that did not trust each other enough to meet anywhere else. The walls were the color of old bone, and the air recycling system made a faint sound every 40 seconds that people who worked there had long stopped hearing. The 40 ambassadors wore their formal dress, deep gray robes with silver thread at the collar, the kind of clothing the hegemony used when it wanted to communicate gravity and authority without aggression. They had prepared materials, position documents, legal frameworks, a detailed record of precedent from the 43 previous correction cases, all of which had resolved through negotiation. They had a lead speaker, Ambassador Vrethoa, who had personally overseen 11 of those resolutions, and who was, by any reasonable measure, the most experienced diplomatic mind the hegemony could send. They sat at the long table in the neutral station's main conference room, and they waited. The human delegation arrived 11 minutes late. One woman, a gray civilian suit, the kind you could buy at any standard outlet, nothing impressive about it. A cup of tea in her hand that was already slightly too cold to be fresh. No data pad. No materials. No support staff visible. She sat down across from 40 ambassadors and their combined centuries of diplomatic experience, and she put the tea on the table and she said, "Dr. Marin Foss, Special Envoy." Then she looked at Ambassador Vrethoa and waited. Vrethoa, who had opened negotiations with 11 civilizations and never once been made to feel uncertain about the shape of the room, felt uncertain about the shape of the room. He began anyway. He was a professional. He laid out the hegemony's position. The corridor had been contested space under hegemony law, long-standing claim, documented and registered, available in the public record. The inexorable had received 3 notifications over the course of 2 standard cycles. The hegemony had followed all required protocols. The outcome, while regrettable, had been lawful under the legal framework that governed contested zone enforcement. He said the word regrettable twice. Dr. Foss listened to all of it. She didn't move. She didn't write anything down. She watched him the way someone watches a door when they're waiting for it to open. When he finished, she said, "We received your notification." Vrethoa waited for more. There was no more. He continued. He explained that the hegemony, in a gesture of goodwill, was prepared to open formal discussions on the corridor's status. A joint commission, a shared administrative framework. The hegemony would consider human commercial access to the corridor under a structured agreement with appropriate fees and schedules. He said the word goodwill once. Dr. Foss took a sip of her cold tea. She said, "We received your notification." The room was quiet. One of the 40 ambassadors shifted in their seat. It was a small movement. The kind of movement a person makes when they have realized that the conversation they prepared for is not the conversation that is happening. Keth Sovara was already gone by the time the first session ended. The news came through on the station's public relay, while the Vreth delegation was returning to their quarters. One of the junior ambassadors saw it first on his personal device and stopped walking so suddenly that the person behind him ran into his back. The senior staff convened in the delegation's private room. They pulled up the sensor data from the relay. They watched what was left of Keth Sovara on the screen, which was, in any meaningful sense, nothing. The bombardment had been precise and total. The evacuation window had been 4 hours. The human fleet had broadcasted in every Vreth language before the first shot was fired. A colonial world of 340 million people. 331 million of them had made it out. 9 million had not. The hegemony had not had 9 million casualties in a single engagement in over a century. Ambassador Vrethoa sat in his chair and looked at the screen, and did not speak for a long time. Then he requested an emergency session with Dr. Foss for the following morning. She agreed. She requested that the session start no earlier than 0900. She said she preferred to have breakfast first. The second session began at 0900 on the mark. Vrethoa came with new materials. The hegemony had authorized him, in an overnight communication from the senior council, to expand the offer. Territorial concession along the corridor's eastern boundary. 3 systems, resource-rich, formally ceded to human authority, under the negotiated framework. Additionally, a reparations payment, a number large enough that when Vrethoa said it aloud, 2 of his own staff glanced at each other. He said it all clearly. He made it plain that this was a serious offer, a real concession, the kind of offer the hegemony had never made to a species it had enacted a correction on in 43 cases. Ever. Dr. Foss listened. She had different tea today. Still going cold. She said, "We received your notification." Vrethoa set his materials down flat on the table. He looked at this woman in her ordinary suit with her cooling tea. He had been in this work for 60 years. He had negotiated with species that breathed ammonia, and species that communicated in color, and species that had no concept of individual identity, and bargained as a collective consciousness. He had never sat across from a single human woman and felt as comprehensively outmaneuvered as he felt right now. And, What was most disorienting about it was that she wasn't doing anything. She was just sitting there. She was just saying the same thing. He said, carefully, "Does the envoy have a counterproposal?" Dr. Foss looked at him. "The envoy received your notification," he said. "The envoy is saying that phrase repeatedly. I want to understand what it means." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "It means we received it. It means we read it. It means we understood what you wrote in it and what you did not write in it." "And what did we not write in it?" She picked up her tea. She looked at it. She put it back down. "That 9 paragraphs costs 847 people." The room was very quiet. "We are in the process," she said, "of writing our response." The third planet was a manufacturing hub called Vrith Sanok, major industrial center, 40 million population, largely workers and their families, the kind of city that existed entirely in service of what it made rather than what it was. The human fleet broadcast the evacuation window at 0340 local time 4 hours, same as before. The broadcast went to every frequency, every emergency channel, every civilian device registered in the system. The Vreth Civil Defense Administration had been quietly preparing since Kethsovara. The evacuation went faster this time. 37 million out. 3 million did not make it to the ships. Vreth Sanok's manufacturing infrastructure, its processing centers, its industrial architecture, all of it, was gone within 6 hours of the evacuation window's close. The fleet did not stay. It left as precisely as it had arrived. The third session between Dr. Foss and Ambassador Vreth Oa happened the following day. He came with more. The hegemony had authorized him to offer formal charges against Sovathur, the admiral who had commanded the destruction of the inexorable. A criminal proceeding. Accountability at the highest visible level. 3 other fleet commanders would stand review. The oversight board that had approved the corridor enforcement policy would be dissolved. A new framework for contested zone engagement, co-written with human representatives, would replace it. He said all of this in a voice that was very level and very tired. Dr. Foss said, "We received your notification." Then she said, "These are hegemony decisions to make. Whether you charge your admiral is a matter for your law, not ours." Vreth Oa said, "Then what is a matter for yours?" She was quiet for a moment. "The schedule," she said. He waited. "We're on a schedule," she said. "It doesn't change based on what's offered here." "What would change it?" She looked at her tea. She seemed to genuinely consider the question, which was somehow worse than if she'd deflected it. "I don't know," she said at last. "That's an honest answer. I was sent here to receive offers, not to make decisions. The people making decisions are not at this table." "Then who is at this table?" "Someone who received your notification." Veth Ori had been in cartography for 6 weeks when the 4th planet was announced. He heard about it the way everyone else in the hegemony heard about it, through the public relay, which the senior council had stopped trying to suppress after Kethsovara because suppression at that scale was impossible and the attempt itself was making things worse. The 4th planet was called Soveth Ra, a historical world. Old. The kind of place that existed in the hegemony's cultural memory. The way certain places exist in every civilization's memory. Not for what they produced, but for what they meant. The evacuation window came and went. 22 million people out. What remained of Soveth Ra was the same as what remained of every world the humans had touched. Nothing. Veth Ori sat at his cartography console and looked at the updated map he kept in his personal file, not the official hegemony map, which was updated through proper channels and which no longer showed Kethsovara or Vreth Sanok or the others as populated worlds, just as coordinates with a new classification that the system had not had a label for 3 months ago, and now had one that everyone had agreed, silently and without discussion, never to say aloud if they could help it. He looked at the pattern. He had been looking at the pattern for weeks. He had mapped it carefully, all the human signals, all the target coordinates, the fleet movements as reported through the relay, the worlds that had been hit. He had overlaid everything. He had done the analysis that he'd been prevented from doing when his access was restricted, using other sources, public sources, the kind of information that existed in plain sight if you looked at enough of it in the right order. The pattern was not random. He had known that from the beginning, but now, with 4 worlds gone, he could see what it was. They were not hitting the hegemony's military strength. They were not hitting the things that would win a war in the traditional sense. They were hitting memory. They were hitting the things that, if you removed them, changed what the hegemony was. Keth Sovara, the oldest colonial world. The first one the hegemony had ever settled beyond its home system. The founding myth of the expansion. Vreth Sanok, the industrial engine that had built every warship in the fleet that destroyed the inexorable. Soveth Ra, the historical seat. The place where the hegemony's founding documents were kept. He stared at his map. He thought about what came next in that pattern. He thought about Veth Mora, the home of the hegemony's central government, the seat of the senior council, the most populated Vreth world, outside of the homeworld itself. He thought about Petra Solms, the journalist in Rotterdam he had sent the initial data packet to 6 weeks ago. He had not been in contact with her since. He did not know if she had acted on the information. He did not know if it had mattered. He pulled out his personal data pad. He looked at it for a long time. Then he composed a new message. Everything. The full analysis, clean and complete. The pattern, laid out clearly enough that anyone with basic spatial reasoning could follow it. The projection forward, what worlds came next if the pattern continued, and why, and what each of them represented in the hegemony's cultural architecture. And at the bottom, the thing he had been carrying alone for 6 weeks. He wrote, "The humans are not trying to defeat us. They are trying to make us understand something. I do not know if there is a number of worlds that finishes this. I do not think they know either. But I know this. What they are taking from us is not territory. Territory can be reclaimed. What they are taking is the story we tell about who we are. When that is gone, there is nothing left to negotiate with." He sent it. This time he sent it to everyone, not just Petra Solms, not just one journalist. He sent it to every public press channel he could reach, every civilian relay, every open communication network. He used the cartography division's standard broadcast credentials, which would expire the moment his supervisor saw what he had done, but which, for the next 40 minutes, gave his message the same distribution priority as official hegemony communications. He sat back. His console would be locked in 40 minutes. He would be removed from his position. He did not know what else would happen to him. He had stopped working out that particular calculation because it led to places that made it hard to continue, and continuing was what he needed to do. He looked at the map. He thought, someone has to say it aloud. The Vreth public knew by morning. Not the sanitized version that the senior council had been releasing through official channels. The version that called the destroyed worlds, administrative adjustments, and described the human fleet's actions in language designed to make them seem like a contained, manageable event. The actual version, Vethori's version, with the maps and the pattern analysis and the projection forward, readable by anyone who wanted to read it. The reaction was not what the senior council had feared. It was quieter. People read it and went very still. The way Yara Ose had gone very still, in a listening post, 17 light minutes from a debris field. The way Vethori had gone still in cartography with the map open and the pattern visible. The stillness of a thing that has been named after a long time, of being unnamed. The senior council convened. It was the longest session in the council's modern history, 19 hours, continuous, with food brought in at hour 7, because it became clear it was not ending. Vethori's analysis sat at the center of the table, printed, annotated by 4 different council members in 4 different colors. They discussed options. They discussed, eventually, the question that Vethori had not quite asked, but had made inevitable by writing everything else. Is there a number? Is there a number of worlds that makes them stop? The intelligence division was asked to respond. The response came in written form, which was unusual. The intelligence division almost never communicated in writing with the full council. The document was 11 pages. The summary was a single line. Unknown. Behavioral modeling non-viable. Species lacks historical precedent for terminal point assessment. One council member asked the intelligence chief, who was present in person, to explain what that meant. The intelligence chief, who was a very old Vreth who had been doing this work for 40 years, and who had a quality of absolute honesty that was either his greatest strength or the reason he would never rise higher than he already had, said, "It means they have never stopped before. Every war they have fought in their recorded history, and they have fought many, more than we have, against each other. Over smaller things than this they have seen through to an end. We do not know what their end is here because we have never given them a reason to define it Until now. He paused. We gave them one, he said. 11 minutes. 847 people. And a notification filed like a shipping receipt. The room was very quiet. I would recommend, he said, that we find out what the number is. How? By asking, he said. Not offering, not negotiating, asking. Vrethoa arrived at the 5th session with nothing in his hands. No materials, no data pad, no position documents. He sat down across from Dr. Foss and her cold tea, and he folded his hands on the table and he said, I have been authorized to ask you a direct question. Dr. Foss waited. Is there a number, he said, that ends this? She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes, not surprise, but recognition. The way a person looks when something they were waiting for finally arrives. She said, I'll transmit that question to the people who make decisions. How long will that take? Not long, she said. She picked up her tea. She put it back down. For what it's worth, she said. And her voice was no different than it had been in every other session. Same flat professional tone. Nothing in it you could call cruel. Nothing in it you could call kind either. Just steady, just present. I think it was a reasonable question. I think you should have asked it sooner. Vrethoa looked at his hands on the table. He said, I think so too. The session lasted 6 minutes. It was the shortest one yet. But it was, in all the ways that mattered, the first one. Outside the neutral station, in the cold of the junction's outer space, the human fleet was already moving toward the next coordinates on its schedule. It had not received new orders. It would not receive them for 3 more days. It kept moving. The schedule did not wait for conversations. The schedule was a thing that had been decided on day 11, in a session that lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds, by 15 votes. No debate, no speeches, and it moved at exactly the speed it had always been going to move at, regardless of anything that happened at a table in an old station that smelled of recycled air and unfinished negotiations. It moved, and 3 days later, when the answer came back from the people who made decisions, it came in the form of a number. Vrethoa read it. He closed his eyes. He sat that way for a moment, alone in his quarters, the station humming around him. Then he opened his eyes. He picked up his communication console. He had work to do. The ceasefire was signed on a Tuesday. Nobody planned it that way. The day of the week was not a thing anyone had considered when the final terms were agreed upon and the signing session was scheduled. It was just the day it happened to fall on. And later, when people wrote about it, they would note the Tuesday the way you note unremarkable weather on the day of a significant event, not because it mattered, but because the ordinariness of it sat so strangely against the size of the thing. On a Tuesday, the Vreth hegemony and the United Nations Space Command signed a ceasefire agreement in the main conference room of the neutral station at Ketvora Junction, in front of 12 witnesses and 1 recording system, in a room that smelled of recycled air and had walls the color of old bone. The agreement was 47 pages. The first appendix was a list of names, all 847 of them, from the inexorable, printed in full, in both human, standard and Vreth, formal script, beginning with the commanding officer and ending with the most junior crew member, a 19-year-old engineering assistant named Pita Taufa, who had been 6 weeks out of training, and who had, according to a note in his personnel file that nobody but his commanding officer had ever read, made the best coffee on the ship. It was the hegemony's senior council that had requested the appendix. They had requested it because Veth Ori's published analysis had made clear, in plain language, that the entire hegemony population had now read, that this had all begun with 847 people who had been filed like a shipping receipt. The council understood, by the time they sat down to finalize terms, that the record needed to say the names, that the names needed to be the first thing in the document, before the territorial clauses and the reparations schedule and the new framework for contested zone engagement. Before everything else, the names. Ambassador Vrethoa signed his section with a steady hand. He had been in this work for 60 years. He had signed 11 previous agreements, all of them from the other side of the table, all of them with a species that had come to terms with what the hegemony was. He signed this one from the side of the table he had never sat on before, and he kept his face very still, and he did not let himself think about the number 7 until he was back in his quarters alone and had closed the door. 7. He sat in his chair and said the word aloud once. because it seemed like the kind of thing that needed to be said by a real voice in a real room, rather than only existing as a figure in a document. 7 worlds. He had negotiated the ceasefire at 7. He had not known, when he asked the question, is there a number, that the answer would be 7. He had not known what 7 would feel like when it arrived. It felt like a door that had been open for a long time finally closing. He was not sure from which side. The galaxy rearranged itself quietly, not all at once, not with announcements or ceremonies or any of the formal structures that civilizations use when they want to mark a shift. It happened the way large things usually happen, gradually, then completely, through 1,000 small decisions made by 1,000 separate parties, who were each, individually, simply updating their understanding of how things were now. The Sulithva, small and purple and perpetually anxious, had been monitoring the situation from the beginning. They had 17 diplomatic observers at the Ketvora Junction, who filed reports every 6 hours. When the ceasefire was signed, their senior council convened and spent 9 hours reviewing the full record of everything that had happened since the Inexorable was destroyed. At the end of the 9 hours, their foreign minister sent a message to the Human Diplomatic Office. The message was brief. It said that the Sulithva had long admired humanity's commitment to its people and wished to open formal trade discussions at the earliest mutual convenience. The Human Diplomatic Office replied within the day. The Sulithva foreign minister, reading the reply, felt something she would later describe to her staff as the particular relief of having been afraid of the wrong thing for a very long time. Other species followed, some quickly, some after a period of careful internal deliberation, some through intermediaries who could maintain plausible distance if the relationship turned out to be a mistake. None of them announced what they were doing in plain terms. None of them had to. The reshaping happened in the language of trade agreements and navigation treaties, and quietly updated threat assessments in military files that would not be declassified for decades. The Vreth hegemony's kill record, 43 civilizations corrected, logged, filed, became a historical document. The kind of thing studied in academic settings. The kind of thing that had a date on it now. Before and after. Soveth Urvas tried. The proceedings lasted 3 weeks. They were conducted within the hegemony's own legal system, as Dr. Foss had noted was a hegemony decision to make. The human government sent no representative, filed no statement. The trial was conducted entirely by Vreth law and Vreth judges and Vreth procedural code, which had not previously had an applicable category for what Soveth had done, because what he had done had always, before now, been filed under enforcement and left there. His defense argued that he had followed every established protocol, that the notification had been issued, that the vessel had not complied, that his actions had been lawful, supported by precedent, approved at every level of the command structure above him. All of that was true. The court found him guilty anyway, not because the law said he was guilty. The law was genuinely unclear, because the law had been written in a time when enforcement was what you did to species that had not yet learned the shape of the world. The court found him guilty because the senior council, during those 19 hours of continuous session, had amended the relevant framework, and the amendment had been backdated to the date of the Inexorable's destruction, which was legally unusual, and had been contested by 4 different advocacy groups and would be challenged in administrative courts for years. The sentence was removal from service and permanent restriction from any command position. He accepted it. He stood in the court and he listened to the sentence and he said nothing. He had known, from the night he read the 2-sentence response and felt the ground shift under him, that something like this was coming. He had known it the way you know a thing that lives in your body before it lives in your head. He returned to his quarters on the Vrath Sol to collect his things. He stood in his command room one last time, the same room where he had watched the sensor data from the Inexorable, the same screen, the same pale blue light. He pulled up the kill report. He looked at the category it was filed under. Miscalculation. He had changed it himself, weeks ago, the night everything began to be clear. He had created the category because the existing ones didn't fit. He looked at it now and he thought about whether it was the right word, whether miscalculation was honest enough for what it was. He decided it was the most honest word he had. He closed the file. He took his personal items and left the ship. He did not look back at it. He was the kind of person who had learned, over 43 corrections and one very long reckoning, that looking back at things did not change them. Vethori was offered a job. The offer came from the Post-War Reconstruction Bureau, a new office established under the ceasefire terms to oversee the documentation and eventual management of the 7 destroyed worlds. The Bureau needed people who understood spatial data, mapping, the particular discipline of looking at a place and recording faithfully what was there rather than what you wished was there. The offer letter noted his previous work, his analysis, the fact that he had published it at personal cost, using credentials he had known would be revoked the moment anyone noticed. His credentials had been revoked within the hour. He had been suspended, formally investigated, cleared on technical grounds because the cartography division's broadcast credentials were not, it turned out, restricted for personal use under any existing regulation. A gap in the policy. The investigation closed with a finding of no violation and a recommendation that the relevant policies be updated. He read the offer letter twice. The job was to catalog what had been lost, to go to 7 coordinates and record, with precision, what was there now, to create a permanent and accurate record that could not be revised or reclassified or filed under language that softened it. He wrote back the same day. He said yes. He packed a bag. He requested transport assignment. He stood at the window of his small apartment in the cartography division's residential block and he looked out at the hegemony city that spread away from him in every direction. Old and dense and still there, still intact. And he thought about 7 worlds that would never again look like this. He thought, someone has to look at it clearly. That was all. He picked up his bag and he left. The 7 worlds stayed empty. There had been debate about this. Significant debate. Within the human government, and in the post-ceasefire joint commission that had been established to manage ongoing relations. The reparations agreement gave the Vreth hegemony full authority to rebuild on the destroyed worlds if it chose to do so. The resources were available. The engineering capacity existed. What was gone was not irreplaceable from a purely physical standpoint. The Joint Commission discussed the option in its 2nd session, then its 5th, then its 9th. Each time, the discussion turned toward the same unresolved question. What were the worlds for now? If you rebuilt on them, they became something new. A new colonial hub, a new manufacturing center, a new historical seat. The things they had been were gone. You could build over the absence, but you could not fill it. And the absence itself, the 7 bare coordinates in the navigation charts of every registered ship in the known galaxy, was something. It was not nothing. It was, as one of the Human Commission members said, quietly, in the 9th session, the only honest record of what had happened. The only version of events that couldn't be revised by a different government in a different decade, or softened by language, or filed under a category that made it easier to carry. 7 coordinates, 7 names, unchanged in the charts. Keth Sovara, Vreth Sanok, Sovithra, and 4 others. Still there, still named, now empty. The commission voted to leave them as they were. No one recorded how the vote went. Nobody needed to. Cressida Vane went home on a Wednesday. The ship that carried her back crossed the distance she had covered going out, which had felt purposeful and direct, and had a clear shape to it, the shape of a thing moving toward something. Going back was different. Going back just felt like distance. She had her own quarters. She slept more than she usually did, which surprised her. And then she understood that her body was settling a debt it had been running for months. She ate at the crew mess when she didn't want to be alone, and in her quarters when she did. She read. She had not read anything that was not a tactical document or a status report in so long that the experience of reading something just because she wanted to felt faintly strange, like using a muscle that had gotten stiff. Sorrow knocked on her door on the 3rd day of the return journey. She let him in. He sat in the chair across from her desk, which was something he never did on duty. He stood, always, unless told otherwise. The posture of someone who had not quite stopped being 26 years old and uncertain of his place. He sat because they were not, technically, on duty anymore, and he was trying to figure out how to be around her, without the structure of duty, to organize it. She understood that. She was trying to figure out the same thing. He asked how she was. She said she was fine. He didn't push it. He talked about other things, his plans when they docked, a friend he was going to see, the small details of a life that had been on hold and was now reassembling itself. She listened. It was good to listen to small things. The small things had been very far away for a long time. When he left, she sat at her desk for a while. Then she went to the bridge. It was quiet. Skeleton crew for the transit. The person at the nav console nodded to her, and she nodded back, and stood at the forward viewport, and looked at the stars going past. Not dramatically, they didn't streak. They didn't blur. Space travel at this speed just looked like stars. The same stars in slightly different positions than before. The notification was still on the wall. She had not taken it down. She didn't know what she would do with it when she got home. She thought about that. She thought about the 9 paragraphs and the 2-sentence response and the 41 days of quiet and 61 ships and 7 worlds, and the name Pita Taufa, 19 years old, the best coffee on the ship, first appendix, last name on the list. She stood there until the nav crew changed shift. Then she went to bed. Her apartment was the same. This always surprised her. When she came back from a long assignment, she had been gone for months, and the apartment had simply continued existing, without any of it mattering to it. The same small kitchen, the same window that looked out over a city that was not beautiful but was hers, dense and functional and full of light at night. The kind of light that meant people were awake in there, living their ordinary lives in the ordinary way. She unpacked. She bought groceries from the place on the corner that had been there since before she had moved in and would probably be there after she was gone. The person at the counter recognized her and said welcome back, and she said thank you, and meant it in a way that was hard to explain. She cooked a meal. She ate it. She washed the dishes. She went to bed at a reasonable hour. She woke up at 0400 and could not go back to sleep. She stood at the kitchen window. The city was mostly dark, the late-night lights giving way to the first thin edge of morning that wasn't quite morning yet. She had a glass of water. She stood and she looked out at the city and she thought. Her personal comm chimed. Sorrow. She had given him her personal number before they docked, because he had asked, and it had seemed like the right thing to do. She answered. His voice was slightly tentative in the way it got, when he wasn't sure if he was overstepping. He said he'd been thinking about her and just wanted to check in, sorry for the hour. He'd seen the time and nearly hadn't called. She said she was glad he did. He asked how she was. She said, I keep thinking about the notification. A small pause. The Vreth one? The 9 paragraphs? Yeah. She looked at the city. The light was starting to change, very slowly, at the furthest edge of the sky. We had 847 people on that ship. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know what the right number was, she said. He didn't answer right away. She was glad he didn't answer right away. She didn't want a quick answer. She wasn't sure she wanted an answer at all. She wanted to say it to someone who would understand what she was actually saying. 7, she said. We stopped at 7. I gave the order to hold at 7, and I'd like to tell you I knew it was right when I gave it, but I'm not sure I did. I'm not sure I do now. You got them to the table. I got them to the table at 7. If it was 5, would they have come? If it was 4? If it was 3? He said quietly. You couldn't know that. No, she said. I couldn't. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window. Outside, the city breathed its slow, nighttime breath. She thought about Kethsovra, the first one, standing at the forward viewport with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the evacuation ships clear the atmosphere, watching the fleet execute with a precision that was almost mechanical, that had been planned down to intervals she had approved personally, and thinking, this is what we decided to become, to get them to the table. She thought about 9 million people who hadn't made it to the ships. Not didn't, hadn't, past tense, already a fixed thing. I keep doing the math, she said, forward and backward. What if we'd stopped earlier? What if we hadn't stopped at 7? Sorrow said, vain. She waited. 847 people, he said. You carried them the whole time. I watched you. And I don't think you're going to stop carrying them. But I also think that if anyone was going to be in that chair, making those calls. He paused. I think it should have been someone who wasn't going to sleep well afterward. She stood at her window. The edge of the sky was going orange now, very slowly. The way morning always came, not all at once. Just a gradual insistence. Light taking back what the dark had borrowed. I'll call you later, she said. Okay. She hung up. She stood at the window until the city was fully light. Until the streets below were moving. People going to work. carrying coffee, moving through their ordinary morning, with the ordinary determination of people who had somewhere to be. She watched them for a long time. She thought about the notification on her wall back on the ship, which was docked now and would be retrofitted and recommissioned and would eventually carry someone else somewhere else. She thought about 7 coordinates in the navigation charts of every ship in the galaxy, sitting there under their old names, empty, not a monument. Nobody had called them that. Nobody had made a speech. There was no ceremony, no day of remembrance established, no formal structure around what they were. They were just there, 7 places that told the truth about what had happened, in the only language that couldn't be revised, the language of what you could see with your own eyes and could not argue with, and could not file under a softer category. She had not decided they would stay empty. That had been the commission, but she understood why. You left them because they were honest. Because honesty, in the long run, was the only thing that held. Everything else, the speeches, the ceremonies, the documents with their careful language could be rewritten, could be reframed, could be made to mean something slightly different by a different government in a different time. But a bare coordinate in a nav chart, a world that was named and present and empty, that just said this happened. She turned from the window. She put her glass in the sink. She put the kettle on. She stood in her small kitchen in her apartment that was the same as it had always been, and she listened to the kettle heat, and she thought about Pita Taufa, 19 years old. Best coffee on the ship. First appendix, last name. She thought, I hope it was enough. She did not know. She would not know. That was the part nobody told you about. That was the part that lived at 0400, at a kitchen window. The part that didn't have a category in any filing system. The part that was not victory or defeat, but something that sat between them in the dark and didn't move. The kettle boiled. She made tea. She sat down at her kitchen table and she held the cup in both hands, and she let the warmth move into her palms, and she breathed. Outside, the city was fully awake. Somewhere, 7 coordinates sat silent in their charts. Somewhere, Vethori was arriving at the first of them with a mapping kit and a data pad and the particular discipline of someone who had decided that looking clearly was the one thing he could do. Somewhere, 847 names sat in the first appendix of a document that would be stored in archives on 3 different worlds and would be read, years from now, by people who had not been born yet. Somewhere, a 19-year-old's name was the last one on the list. She drank her tea. The morning came in through the window the way it always did. It did not ask her if she had done the right thing. She was glad for that. She would keep asking herself. That, she had decided, was the only honest way to carry it.